host of Higher Education Today, a production of the University of the District of Columbia. Welcome back to the education program that connects you to contemporary issues, people, and institutions involved in the world of higher education. Today we'll be talking about motivation, learning styles, and rewards. Dan Pink is author of 4 best-selling books: Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us, The Adventures of Johnny Bunko, Free Agent Nation, and A Whole New Mind, Why Right-Brainers Will Rule the Future. Dan was a White House speechwriter for former Vice President Al Gore. Dr. April Massey is Assistant Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences here at UDC. Her expertise includes languages, communication disorders, degree progression, transfer evaluations, and concurrent enrollment. Dean Massey has degrees from Ohio State, the University of Cincinnati, and Howard University. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. Well, if I could start with you, Dan, if we could talk a little bit about motivation and intrinsic motivation and rewards. You've written a lot about this. What do you think are appropriate ways that we should motivate people, and what sorts of reward systems do you think that we should use?
Well, I think what we should do in any kind of reward system is base it on science and evidence rather than on folklore. And if you go back and look at about 50 years of research on human motivation, what it says is this: our simple-minded belief that if you reward behavior, you get more of it, and if you punish it, you get less of it, is true sometimes, but not true all the time, and not true nearly as much as we think. And one of the big salient findings from the last 50 years is that particularly if you want people to do more complicated, creative, conceptual kind of work, the classic kind of motivator that we use in organizations and that we also rely on in schools, what I call an if-then motivator. If you do this, then you get that. Those are great for simple mechanical tasks. They're really not effective for complex, creative, conceptual tasks. And what we have now is we have an economy built on these more conceptual, creative tasks, and we have higher education that is supposed to be preparing people for these tasks. So essentially what we have in many cases is a motivational operating system that is good for 19th century work, pretty good for 20th century work, and that's just out of date for 21st century work.
So what do you think universities should do in order to motivate people for today's world rather than yesterday's world?
Well, I think they should rely less on these kind of contingent if-then motivators. So it can be a whole array of things. And again, if you're talking about recasting higher education, it's about more than simply motivation. I mean, to me, at least to my mind, the biggest issue in higher education is access rather than motivation, so that you have folks who can't even get through the door in the first place to find their motivation. But once you do that, I think it's a matter of giving students a little bit more autonomy, about bringing our education technologies and our education approaches much more in line with what we know motivates people to master complex things. And also coming back to the idea of the purpose. What's the point of the exercise? And I think a lot of times that question of why are we doing this in the first place gets lost.
And Dean Massey, you're a dean here, and you've had a lot of experience not only in the classroom but with many professors here. Do you agree with Dan's analysis of how we need to kind of tweak the motivation system?
I absolutely do agree. And I think that a part of this that I was thinking about last night as I was kind of preparing something at home, it seems that I thought about myself and many of my contemporaries in terms of our training to actually be in academia. We were trained using a model that really fits with an if-then. And so our approach to instruction really is founded on a model that's outdated. So as we work to ensure that students have access and opportunity that fits with 21st century expectations, there's a need for retreading in terms of just the founding piece of an institution, your instructional staff. And so I do see an absolute alignment, but I think the work of institutions is really about looking at ways of retraining the staff that they have in place, because our training hasn't prepared us really for the students that we're currently teaching.
But maybe we should blame some of the students too. I mean, if you think about it, wouldn't a student come in the class and say, well, what do I need to do to get an A?
And often students do come into class and ask that very question. And often the way that we choose to engage with students from point of entry to point of exit, it's around, if you do this, I can guarantee you this. And there really, is no guarantee that the outcome is going to be what the input would expect it to be. That's one. And so we have students, and that's what grade change challenges are always about. But you told me, your syllabus told me, if I do A, B, C, and D, I was never late. I was never absent. I turned everything in on time. I read everything that you said, and still, I didn't get the grade. The grade that you gave me is not the grade that I believe that I earned. So I think that it is an issue. We can't guarantee. And we're creating processes that won't give outcomes that make sense for students.
Well, maybe I could ask both of you then what's the path forward if this is obviously a problem, because kids really are walking into classrooms asking that right now. We all know that. So how do we encourage kids to not do that, and how do we encourage professors to say, well, here's a different model?
It's a difficult challenge. We have to go back to first principles. What's the point of a grade in the first place? Why do we have grades? And grades are a form of feedback. They let you know whether you're making progress. The problem has become, at least in my view, in I think many institutions of learning, that grades have become the point. That the reason you go to class is to get a grade. And so they've morphed from being feedback to being the goal in itself. Now, we can wring our hands about that and say that isn't nice, but again, let's look at the evidence. The evidence in a huge body of social science says that there's a big difference between what are called performance goals and what are called learning goals. Performance goals is getting an A. Learning goals is learning the stuff. Right. And we have this mistaken belief that if people satisfy the performance goals, they're going to learn. And that just isn't true. I'll tell you, I'm an example. I studied French for 6 years. 6 years. I got A's in French for 6 years. I can't speak French. Why? Because the point of the exercise was to get an A on the quiz, to know the third person plural subjunctive of aller, and not to have not to actually learn something. And so I think we really do kids a disservice. And then, as Dr. Massey was talking about, we have the related problem and in going with what you're saying, Steve, is I think we also have a sense of entitlement. It's like if I show up and I'm completely compliant, then I deserve a certain grade. And I think that's not how the real world works.
Right. Well, in the real world, presumably, not presumably, but the real world, in the world of work, people are rewarded based on what they accomplish. But I think what's interesting, and Dean Massey, I'd be interested in your thought on this in particular, is in the world of work, we're trying to accomplish XYZ goal. But if Professor Jones says to us, or Professor Smith says to us, I want you to do these 3 things, a student now says, I'm going to do those 3 things and get that A that Dan suggested. How do we deal with that?
You're right. One of the things that we're looking at, though, is to build in new expectations. And I think that we can minimize what grades do to instructors and students by building in other contingencies around showing that you're learning. And that's the piece that we haven't done. And we haven't done even using graded performance, not to necessarily feed a grade as an end, but as an indicator of progress toward an end that's not a grade. And so we've been working with faculty in the College of Arts and Sciences just to look at the use of contingency and to use graded performance as a way to inform not just you about what a student's doing, but a student about what he or she is doing. So we've built in, grades are there, but they're ungraded relative to the final outcome. So students can see, as predictors of ability to reach an end that makes sense in the broader view. So it's not just about that course or that measure of progress in that course, but how that outcome fits with something that's bigger than that semester. We haven't done a good job of that. I think we're learning how to do that better. And I think as we engage people around opportunities to improve what we do with students, people are getting energized and they're encouraged. But I think it's about teaching and learning, and reversing teaching and learning and the learning piece, because I think most people still create a course by identifying a book, aligning a book's table of contents with the syllabus and its development, and they kind of back their way into what a course will be, as opposed to looking at larger outcomes in terms of expectations for what will give not just success in terms of a broader discipline expectation or work toward occupation, but also what satisfies. And satisfaction really is not built on a dictate of somebody else. It's what you really see that you're gaining for yourself. That piece we haven't done well. I think we're learning how to do it better. I think that having engaged Dr. Bain, who will be joining us in January, who's an expert internationally recognized in this very area, I think it really does give us an opportunity to really use the institution as a laboratory for learning and work around learning. And I think there's some fundamental pieces that will happen with instructors, and students will be a second piece in terms of us moving that way.
And in terms of moving from the learning to getting jobs, because a lot of the kids, not only at this university, but many universities are focused on getting jobs, how can we tie what students are learning into their ability to kind of go into the workforce and be creative and add value in the workforce?
Well, I mean, there are all kinds of things. You can basically break down the wall between what is education and what is the real world. I mean, both of those are in some ways ridiculous constructs. I mean, and so you could, so you see this even at some very successful secondary school programs for often for low-income kids. They'll say, come in. There's a group of schools called Big Picture schools that are public schools throughout the United States. I happen to be involved with them, so that's in the interest of full disclosure. But what they do is a kid comes in and they say, what are you interested in? They build a curriculum around the kid's interests, and part of that is internships. So if you're interested, you come to me, I'm an instructor, and you say I'm interested in martial arts. We find you an internship at a martial arts studio for a couple of days a week. You learn math through martial arts. You learn physics through martial arts. You read about martial arts. You write about that. And what's interesting about that approach that breaks down this bucket is education, this bucket is the real world, is that those kids end up doing far, far better than their peers on the conventional measures, on the state standardized tests in math and in reading, because you've made something relevant. You've given it a context. And the thing is, Steve, sort of frustrating is that this stuff goes on all the time. Okay, think about this. We have, everybody around this table, and probably everybody watching at home, has in their pocket or their briefcase or their purse a smartphone. That smartphone probably has apps. Those apps are a multi-billion-dollar a year business. Who taught everybody how to make these apps? There wasn't a certification, there wasn't a college degree in apps, there wasn't a university of apps. How did people possibly figure this out? And well, because they were interested in it. It was interesting, it was challenging, they learned from each other, there was a relevance to what they were doing. So you know what? They mastered it, they got good at it. And I think that that institutions should look to those kinds of things and say, what can we learn from that?
But we seem to be doing the opposite, because a lot of universities are now saying, okay, we need to do all sorts of core requirements for students.
Well, I think that some of us are saying that, but I think some of us are saying that we have to do core requirements, but to build those around what makes sense for beyond the walls of the institution. So for example, we just did a major revision of our general education core. And our core was more than 30 years old, and so it really was one of those menu-based things where you went in and you picked a course from social sciences, you picked a course from the humanities, you picked, with no connections. So we do have some focus on skills, we do have some focus on content, but we have a lot of focus on bringing kids together to share what they know and to allow them to challenge systems and to use opportunities for challenge to build new schemes and new opportunities for themselves. So while we have a first 2 years of a lot of skill building around written language, quantitative reasoning, critical thinking kinds of things, but in the junior and senior years, we have opportunities for them to come back together in service learning, study away, study abroad kinds of opportunities where they negotiate what they're going to focus on and how they're going to approach the work of getting that thing done. It allows them to come together after they've done some discipline-specific work, so you have mathematicians and engineers, but you also have social workers and sociologists who come into the same classrooms, and they do this work together in the same way they'll be expected to work in the world, where there will be different people at different stages of career preparation and those kinds of things. I think for us that's a beginning to get our students to a place where they'll be able to meet with success outside of here.
But how much do you think that we should encourage, and I'll throw this to both of you, how much do you think we should encourage people to study things that perhaps aren't the things they love? Notwithstanding what you just said a second ago, Dan, and Dr. Massey, what you're alluding to as well, I mean, it seems to me that students need to know a core of something, some body of knowledge, and then beyond that, to specialize in whatever it is they love. I think we would all agree on that. But it seems to me that the tough part here is figuring out exactly where that middle point is. So how much do we make students uncomfortable with perhaps learning what they may not want to necessarily learn or have to learn today, kind of like eating your vegetables in order to grow, versus finding the love of doing the apps or something else that you want to do?
I think there are ways of actually working them through the discomfort by
Yes.
giving them some control over how they're engaged in the uncomfortable places. I think that's the responsibility of the institution.
And I think it's the responsibility of the instructor. That is, I agree with you that there's a certain core set of knowledge and a core set of abilities that you need to have as an effective citizen and as a contributor to society. I mean, Dr. Massey was talking about quantitative reasoning, being able to analyze text, written skills, scientific literacy. I think those are absolutely essential. The question is, how do you do that? And I think we need to challenge this idea that the way you do that is you have an instructor in a big room with a bunch of people parading around for 47 minutes telling them what that instructor already knows. Right. And I think that offering even a little bit more autonomy in those realms can be really useful. So for instance, I mean, again, we don't reason enough from our own experience here. Yeah. I'm pretty good at math. You know one reason I'm pretty good at math? Because I was a baseball fan when I was a kid. And if you actually care about baseball, you get pretty good at math. Absolutely. Okay? So that's one reason I have some quantitative skills. Absolutely. I think that for writing, give kids greater discretion over what they actually write about, and they'll be much more engaged and they'll do better work. The same thing is true, I think, especially in our approach to science, is that we have science as basically this recitation of facts, memorization of facts, marching lockstep, and it's not enough built around inquiry. I think as human beings, we're interested in why the world works. Why does, if I drop a pen, why does it drop to the ground like that? Why does, when I add the vinegar and baking soda to make that big bubbly thing in volcanoes, why does that happen? And I think that it's less of a Hobson's choice than we often think that it is.
Fair enough. Dan, would you say a word or two about your work about the left brain and the right brain?
Yeah, although, I mean, here's the thing. There's been so much, I use the left brain, right brain as a metaphor. As neuroscience, there's been a lot of really bad stuff written on this. And the truth is our brains are really complex. We use both sides of our brain for everything that we do. Okay, but there is specialization in our brains. This side deals with things that are logical, linear, sequential. This side deals with things that are big picture, synthetic, contextual. Again, but we use both sides of our brain for everything. But that rough division of labor is a pretty powerful metaphor, because the sort of left brain abilities, the metaphorically left brain abilities, what we can think of as spreadsheet abilities, they still matter. Mm-hmm. But they're not enough for very hard-headed reasons. Those kinds of abilities can be automated, all right? It used to be, some people used to need an accountant to do their individual income tax. Well, last year, 27 million people did their taxes on TurboTax, a $29 piece of software, because that software can do that kind of work. Also, we have, it's possible to outsource white-collar work. So basically what we have software doing to our brains what machines did to our back a generation ago. And we have white-collar work going the route, certain kinds of white-collar work going the route of blue-collar work, that it can be done cheaper overseas. But it's really those kind of routine, algorithmic, mechanical kinds of abilities that are necessary but not sufficient. And it's really these kinds of abilities: artistry, empathy, inventiveness, big picture thinking, multidisciplinary thinking. That's really where the competitive advantage is.
And Dr. Massey, do you see UDC being able to kind of capitalize on some of this in its curriculum redevelopment?
Absolutely, and I really do think that in terms of looking at hemispheric lateralization, I think that our responsibility is to engage. I mean, there's been a lot of work about hemisync and what happens when you engage both hemispheres for a better outcome. And I think the classroom should really work to engage, because people learn differently without regard for, hemispheric control. So you really want to engage people in a way that they're able to make best use of all the resources of the brain. And I think that we're doing work that way, and some of that work is led by what we know from areas of clinical science around language, loss, and recovery. But I think that there are lots of opportunities for us to engage students in that way, and our classrooms are more and more reflecting that we have a better understanding of how best to engage whole brain for better outcomes. And
do you think that adult students do this better than traditionally aged students?
I don't know that I could say that. I can't say that. I don't have information to.
And what do you think about that, Dan?
I don't know. I mean, I have a gut instinct that adult students might be more demanding in this regard. That, first of all, adult students have a wider set of experiences, so they're better able to put things in context. And I think context really matters in education. So you're not dealing with discrete little nuggets of facts. How does it connect to everything else? And I think people who come with more experience are better at that. The other thing is that sometimes adult learners have taken a hiatus from traditional education, and as a result, they have unlearned some bad habits. They unlearned some of the habits of compliance, unlearned some of the habits of basically performing rather than learning, and so I think maybe they have a better shot.
Do you think that we should mandate art classes?
Mandate? What do you mean
in different levels? I mean, so you've written extensively about the power of art and creativity.
Yeah.
Do you think that we should say to some high schools or to some universities that's college, that if you're a student at this school, you need to take an art class?
I think that we should be encouraging people to think and reason and express themselves artistically. Right. Having a mandate, everybody must oil paint, doesn't strike me as the right way to do it. Or having, standardized tests for painting doesn't strike me as, because you have people painting to the test. And so, but I do think that ability to reason as artists reason, which is holistic reasoning, synthetic reasoning, expressing oneself clearly, tapping other people's emotions, making new combinations, is a profoundly important cognitive skill. And I think it's a cognitive skill that is taught very much through the arts.
Mm-hmm. And do you think we can do, maybe to both of you, do you think we can teach that in group format?
I think we can.
Sure.
I think we can. And I think that probably the bigger piece for students on a college campus, not directing them to a course, but allowing them opportunity. And I think that some people see that engagement in artistic forms of expression are less scary, less anxiety producing. So your outcome really is a reflection of not so much your skill, but maybe your interpretation. Mm-hmm. And so opportunity for just exploring without fear of failure, you might get a better outcome for students in terms of just their willingness to engage and be more free in terms of how they approach and their willingness to experiment what they know or don't know and what they can create from that.
And do you think a larger university can do this better than a smaller university?
No, I don't think size is a factor.
Do you think?
I agree with that. I think it depends on the people and the willingness to do things. The other thing, I mean, as Dr. Massey was saying about the arts, and I think it's true of other sorts of things. I think it's true of sports. I think it's true of team sports. Is that one of the things that artists learn, particularly musical artists, theatrical artists, is that your performance affects other people's performance. Mm-hmm. Their performance affects your performance. Mm-hmm. That's true in almost every workplace I know. Absolutely. That's a big learning for human beings. Most of us don't realize that until we get out into the world of work and say, oh my God, I'm working with a bunch of idiots, or wow, these people are awesome, and because I'm around these awesome people, I'm doing better. And anybody involved in theatrical arts, musical arts, or team sports understands that in their bones, and I think that's really important.
Well, and how do we motivate people to do more team things then if some of it's interesting, at least from where I sit, that some schools are moving in the direction of making sure that students do things in groups, mm-hmm. but other universities are moving in the direction of having students do things individually and then present their work to groups.
We're actually doing both. We have opportunities for students to self-select group. We have some groups that we impose on students. We have some groups that by the model of the working of the group that students see it and they want to be a part of it. I'll give you an example. Our theater program, most of our productions, about half of the students engaged, they're not theater students. They're students who have watched the teams work on productions and they want to be a part of it because of what they gain. So I think that there are any of a number of models. I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all.
Fair enough. I think we only have time for one or two more questions. The issue of alumni, is there anything that universities can do right now to further engage alumni rather than simply ask them for money?
You know, we are trying to engage alumni members with just some events that really are focused on current students, but that offer opportunities for learning to anybody that's interested. And I think that I'll speak about the College of Arts and Sciences specifically, not university-wide. We just haven't really done that piece in terms of relationship building, and so you're right. We usually go after alumni for money, and of course they say, but you know what, I hadn't heard from you prior. I've not been engaged with you since I left the institution. And I think there are lots of opportunities just to build relationship around things that people routinely do. We're doing a big read, so we're bringing a panel of experts to the campus the end of this month, a book that's the Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. So it crosses lots of lines her only living child is going to be one of the members of our panel. That's something that reaches to anybody. It crosses gender, it crosses money, it crosses a lot of things. So we have a lot of interest now. We just haven't done a lot of that, and our outreach to alumni has been about money.
I don't know the solution, but I think it's a huge opportunity. Can't think of a single higher education institution that does that well.
Fair enough. All right, and final question is, in a few seconds, what advice would you have for young people watching the show today in terms of taking some of the ideas that we've talked about? Just if you can, any last minute advice for our students?
I think that there are no limits. They should see no limits, and that they should pursue the things that are important to them. No limits.
I think it's figure out what you're good at and what you really like to do.
And then just take it from there.
I think that's a good first step.
Well,
and work 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 and work.
After you figure out what you love to do.
Yeah, but the thing is, those things go together because you're more likely to work hard at something that you're good at and that you love to do. And so, so it's not simply saying, oh, I discovered what I love to do and what I'm good at, but there are massive returns to doggedness and persistence. But you're more dogged and persistent when you're doing something you believe in, something that you really enjoy.
Fair enough. Thank you both. If you would like additional information about author Dan Pink or Dean April Massey's work here at the University of the District of Columbia, please visit danpink.com or udc.edu. Thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. Please join me again for another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm Steven Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.